Good morning, Friendship United Methodist Church. I'd like to welcome you on this 25th day of June 2023. Have you ever committed yourself to a project or a goal and then changed your mind? And I know I have. Have you ever thought, maybe I bit off more than I could chew, or this is going to take more time and more energy and more of me than I expected? And then anxiety sets in and regret. And we have two choices at this point: double down on our commitment in that project or goal, or walk away and admit that we weren't prepared to give our best effort. And that's not an easy choice to make, isn't it? Back in 2019, history professor in the United Kingdom translated a letter from the 14th century about a nun named Joan of Leeds, Leeds, who faked her own death to get out of a commitment to the church. Goodness. William Melton, the Archbishop of York, wrote in a letter in 1318 that describes Joan with the help of accomplices escaping the convent. The Archbishop wrote that Joan crafted a dummy in the likeness of her body in order to mislead the devoted faithful. And she had no shame at all, in order to mislead the devoted faithful. And as the dummy was buried in a sacred place amongst the religious persons of that day, of that church. Okay? Goodness. We all have trouble following through on commitment sometimes, don't we? But few of us, quit on such a spectacular manner as Joan of Leeds. Now, to fake your own death to get out of a commitment to the church is a clear sign that you weren't really committed to begin with. Okay? On the other hand, there's an amusing but thought-provoking story by Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard about the differences between making a contribution and making a commitment. With me? Making a contribution and making a commitment. Okay? The story is set in a small town where citizens are very proud of their fire chief. He was a pleasant man, well liked and by everyone in town. And one day the fire chief rounded up a brigade to respond to a very dangerous fire in town. But when the fire brigade arrived, they couldn't reach the fire because all the well-meaning townspeople were in the way. The citizens of this town thought that they would help their beloved fire chief. That they would be putting out this fire before he even got there. And yet, they were only equipped with small squirt pistols. And you can imagine how that. And as they squirted tiny streams of water on the fire, they commented what they believed in the good work of the fire chief and wanted to make their own contribution to it. Okay? They really thought they were being helpful on this, even though it was a small amount of water. And the fire chief and the brigade couldn't get through the townspeople, and he in a fit of rage, he shouts at them, "Get out of here! Fires like this are not for the well-meaning people who want to make limited contributions. Such situations demand firemen who are ready to risk their lives in putting out the flames." Kierkegaard is making the point with this story, that many people want to contribute to Jesus' work, but few want to commit to it. And we know that all too well. All churches struggle with this problem. And that's the focus of our Bible passage for today, friends. Do we really understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus? Is he asking us to make a contribution to his work or a commitment? Okay? Now, in this passage, Jesus is saying, I'm asking you to trust everything to me. My goodness, guys. I'm asking you to trust everything to me. And this is one of those difficult passages that really steps on the toes. And it has, and it's one of the passages not a lot of pastors want to preach on or do preach on. What would that look like in your life to trust everything to Jesus' care? What would that look like for you? How would you live differently from the way you're living now? And what could you accomplish for God's sake if you make that decision today? And Jesus finishes this passage by saying, whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Hard words. We've heard them so many times over the years, but whoever finds their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Pastor John Huffman heard an interview many years ago with missionary Elisabeth Elliot, in which she recalled the many challenges she and her husband, Jim Elliot, faced in their mission work in Ecuador. Elliot was working as a translator in a remote area of Ecuador when her indigenous assistant was murdered, and all her language materials were stolen. A flood destroyed the station Jim Elliot was working on, and finally, Elizabeth's husband, Jim, was murdered by the indigenous people and with whom he was trying to share the gospel. And in this interview, Elisabeth Elliot said, when I was 12 years old, I told the Lord I wanted him to work out his will in my life at any cost. That's what I told him. Okay? When he set about doing that, however, I was amazed. I didn't think it was going to be that way. We never do we? We never do. Now, the ministries, it seems a lot different before you enter it than it does when you are a pastor. The will of God, friends, is never exactly what you expect it to be. The disciples found that out. We find that out. It may seem much worse, but in the end, it's going to be a lot better and a lot bigger. And that's why we have to trust everything to Jesus. We have to trust that the will of God is going to be a lot better and a lot bigger than we can see right now. We really do. I trust that God's going to grow Friendship United Methodist Church beyond these buildings into the surrounding land around us. I really believe that that can happen. But it's going to take commitment, okay? After all, Jesus wasn't asking us, and he's the disciples, and he's not asking us to do anything that he didn't do himself. Look at the words in verse 38 again. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow, and I put the emphasis on follow me, for Jesus, the cross meant death, okay? But because of Jesus' death and resurrection, the cross is new life for us. And that new life isn't conventional and it's not comfortable. It will separate us from the values, the priorities, and the rewards of our culture. It may separate us from the people that we love the most. Pastors have a difficult time in their family life sometimes, and their parents, their friends, they expect different things from them now. In the late 1600s, there was a parlor game called Cross Purposes. And you'd take a group of people and you'd split them up into two teams, and one half of the participants would get a question on a subject, and the other half would get an answer or an explanation. Then everyone would be set loose to find the explanation that matched the subject. The game could be very fun if people accidentally matched the wrong subjects and explanations. Today, we use the name of this game to describe a less pleasant situation. When we say that people are working at cross purposes, we mean that they have conflicting goals that can't be reconciled. You can't follow God and mammon at the same time. And that's what Jesus wanted us to think about, guys. The way of the cross is incompatible with the ways of the world. If we are followers of Jesus, our lives shouldn't make sense to others. Our commitment to God's purposes, our trust to God's plans, should make us look radical and foolish and out of step with our culture. And that brings us to the second thing Jesus is telling us in this passage. Trust that God cares about your life. Trust that God cares about your life. Jesus challenges his disciples to live boldly, to stand up for their faith in ways that put them at odds with the religious establishment and the Roman government. Yes. Then he says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Do not be afraid of those that can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, he says, and yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are numbered, in my case, the lack of hair, but he knows every one of them. So don't be afraid. You're more worthy, and you're worth more than many sparrows. And that's why Jesus can tell us not to be afraid, even in the face of challenging and uncertain circumstances. Even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows. Your life, friends, is not meaningless or random. God has a purpose for you being where you are. The God who created our vast universe, knows you and me, all persons, individually. And God values you. God values me. He values you, everyone. The God who made you in his holy image will never leave you nor forsake you. And if you really believe this, our fears will evaporate. If we really believe it, our fears will evaporate, friends. We could take up our cross and follow Jesus with confidence, knowing that God, who loves us enough to count the very hairs on our head, has a purpose for our lives. We read a wonderful story about a lady named Betty Green, who embodied living boldly for the work of Christ. And Betty was born in 1920, a long time ago, over 100 years ago. She's not alive today, by the way. At a young age, she developed a passion, a real passion for airplanes and for mission work. And when she got her pilot's license at the age of 16, she never dreamed how God could use her two passions to further the work of his kingdom. At the start of World War II, Betty joined the Women's Air Force Service pilots. And these women tested and delivered planes, tested them before the guys got in them, and instructed male pilot cadets and aided the fighter pilots in gunnery practice and flew missions looking for enemy searchlights. Dangerous stuff. And although Betty enjoyed her work, she wrote an article during this time in which she noted, "I am eagerly awaiting the time when God will use my flying to take the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ to those who are without Christ." Amen. Wow. After the war, she had that opportunity. And she helped to found a mission aviation organization, which is still in operation today under the name Mission Aviation Fellowship. Betty was the first employee of that organization, as you imagine, and piloted its first flight, taking 2 Bible translators to a remote part of Mexico. She spent 16 years flying for the Mission Aviation Fellowship, carrying missionaries and doctors and dentists and aid workers, medical equipment to the most remote areas of Mexico and Peru and Sudan and New Guinea and Nigeria. She flew all these flights. Are you ready? She flew all of these flights without the benefit of GPSs or modern equipment, just the stars, guys. And she flew to areas where there were no airports or landing strips and unreliable radio communications. Every flight was a risk. She was committed. She was contributing to God's work, but she was committed to do that work. But Betty Green gladly accepted these risks in order to bring the gospel and medical care to isolated people in the poorest parts of the world. Today, the organization she helped to establish works with more than 400 mission agencies and nonprofit organizations to provide clean water and medical supplies, disaster relief materials, humanitarian aid, education, and Christian outreach to the most remote parts of the world. Betty Green took on a dangerous and challenging mission with joy because what? Answer. Fred? Because she trusted God. That's right, yes. She trusted God with her life. Now, whether she lived or died, she knew that her Heavenly Father knew her, loved her, and was working with and through her. And this truth gave her the courage to commit everything to Jesus. And the final thing that Jesus is saying in this passage is, if you trust everything to me, you will find abundant and eternal rewards. Let's look at verse 39 once again. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. There's joy and peace in living for God's purposes, friends. Joy and peace that no earthly rewards can ever imagine. My retirement, I pray your retirement, is going to be out of this world in the heavenly kingdom. Wow. And friends, I hate to tell you this morning, but I'm going to. We're going to spend eternity in one of 2 places. And that choice is up to you. You can commit your life to Christ, or you can commit your life to Satan. You can live eternally in the kingdom of heaven, or you can burn eternally in the flames of hell. There's no other way to put it. There's joy and peace in living God's purposes, and a joy and peace that no earthly rewards can imagine. There's a reason that this verse is quoted in all 4 Gospels. All 4. This is one of those sections that's quoted, and we may have versions of things, in 1 or 2 Gospels. But this is in all 4 Gospels. That's how important it is. It's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's an ironclad promise from the God who willingly gave up his life, his own life, to save us. God created us for a life of abundant joy, peace, and purposes that can only be found in knowing him and living for his purposes. And I want you to meditate on this question in the upcoming week. Is what you're living for worth dying for? Does your life reflect the priorities and purposes of God? Does it? Are you living out your faith with boldness and confidence, even when that separates you from the surrounding culture? Maybe even alienates you from friends. And finally, do you trust Jesus' promises enough to take up your cross and follow him? And if you do, you will find joy, hope, and peace that can only come from living for eternal rewards, those that are stored up in heaven. You have a choice to make. You have a choice to make. Eternity in heaven or eternity in hell. I pray that you make the right choice. Are you contributing or are you committed? Are you contributing to Satan and committed to Christ? Or are you committed to Satan and contributing to Christ? God bless, and I pray that you make a God decision this morning.